Hello everyone, welcome to the GeoEcolologist. In this session, we are going to learn about the history of pandemics today. So first question is, why do we need to understand the history of pandemics? Remember, it is very much important to learn from the past. So that's why our history will be our teacher in order to cope with the current situation of COVID-19 that we are facing. So let's look at the history and let's look at the top 20 cases where we can say that yes, these are the important parts of our history from where we can seek lessons and we can implement in today's world. So let's go ahead and look at the top 20 pandemics in the world. But before that, please like and subscribe to my channel, and also please press the bell icon for the further updates. Now, let's look at the basic idea of plagues, epidemics and pandemics. So they have ravaged humanity throughout the existence of human beings themselves, right? So from the early times to the present, we see there are numerous plagues, epidemics and pandemics happening. So throughout the course of history, disease outbreaks have been commonly ravaging our humanity, our society. So sometimes they also have power to impact the course of history. Like for current scenario, it is definitely a historical situation when the entire world is shut down, right? So it has the power to change the course of history, and that's why it is important, and it is basically many a times signaling about the end of this civilization as well. So let's see the top 20 pandemics or epidemics and plagues all together till now. So first is the prehistoric epidemic, right? So prehistoric epidemic, 5,000 years ago, about an epidemic that wiped the entire prehistoric village in China. If you see in the image, the discovery of a 5,000-year-old house in China with all the skeletal remains. So the bodies of dead were stuffed inside a house and were burnt. All the age groups were there in that, right? So what happened? No age group was spared. So the archaeological site is currently known as Hamin Mangha and is one of the best preserved prehistoric sites in northeastern China. So this is the first case that we see is about 3000 BC, for which we have evidences, right? Let's see further. Now number 2, plague of Athens, 430 before Christ. So let's look at that. Around 430 before Christ, the war between Athens and Sparta began. And then during that time, an epidemic also ravaged the Athenians, basically the Athens part, right? And almost for 5 years, and the estimation is about 1 lakh people were killed. The death toll was about that high, right? Then Antonine plague, 165 to 180 common era, that is very much important. So what do you get here? It's basically when soldiers returned to the Roman Empire after all their campaigns. With them, they brought the joy of victory, but also they brought this plague as well, right? So Antonine plague, basically, which may have been smallpox at large, killed over 5 million people in the Roman Empire. So the epidemic actually lasted the Pax Romana, that is, we call the Roman peace. So this epidemic has such a power that it was almost the end of the Roman Empire, or so-called the peace age of the Roman Empire, right? Now, plague of Cyprian. It's very much important because it is also symbolizing the end of the world, right? So named after Saint Cyprian, a bishop in Carthage, right? So who described epidemic as end of the world, and this also led to about 5,000 people in single day, right? Still some remains you can see there in the image. Then plague of Justinian. Let's see that. If you can see the time period, it's about in mid of 6th century. So Byzantine Empire, as we remember, it was attacked, it was hit by bubonic plague, and what happened? Its decline started during this time period. The plague reoccurred periodically many times, and it is said, it is estimated about that it ended 10% of the world's population at that time. 10%. So the plague is named after Byzantine Empire, Justinian. Now, number 6, the Black Death. Very famously 14th century Black Death. It's very famous, and many stories are also there about it. Many movies have also showcased it. So the Black Death traveled from Asia to Europe, leaving devastation, right? So some estimates suggest that it wiped over half of Europe's population. And very interestingly, if you remember, it was a bacteria that causes the strain of bacteria, that is Yersinia pestis, Many times this has come up in many documentaries, in many movies, many times it has again come up. So this is very much important, and it was spread through rodents. Now, the bodies of victims were buried in mass graves during this time. Now let's look at the 7th one. Okay, so it's Cocoliztli. Cocoliztli epidemic is about mid of 16th century, and infection was caused by the Cocoliztli epidemic. That is important to understand. It was a basic viral hemorrhage fever, right? And it impacted Mexico and Central America. So Cocoliztli is basically an Aztec civilization, American civilization if you study. So it is basically an Aztec word for pests, right? So a recent study that examined DNA from the skeletons of victims found that it was basically a Salmonella typhi C, which is a typhoid. So remember, during that time, typhoid was such a big thing that it had no cure, and it led to mass extinction. 15 million people in Mexico and Central America. Just imagine. Now, 8th number. American plague, 16th century, very famously known. So American plagues are basically clusters in which they were brought from the travelers from Europe, right? And it completely almost shattered the Incas and Aztec civilization, and it was largely a smallpox. So some estimates suggest that 90% of indigenous population in 16th century was completely dilapidated in Western Hemisphere because of this. Okay, that's why it is one of the largest pandemics in 16th century. Now, Great Plague of London. Although you find it is a localized, but it had impact on the entire Western Europe in mid of 17th century. It's Black Death, and very much famously during King Charles II. The plague started in April, that is currently we are in April in 2020. So it was the same time where April 1665, and it was sporadically, in a rapid manner, it flew across the entire England and entire Western Europe, and this was the summer months. So by the time it ended, almost more than 1 lakh people died, about wiping 15% of the London's population at that time. 10th, Great Plague of Marseille. So it is now 18th century we are coming in, and look at that, Industrial Revolution had begun, shipping corporations have moved. So what happened here? Now, Great Plague of Marseille started when ship called Grand Saint Antonin docked in Marseille. So now movement was there of goods and people, and with them also plague as well moved, right? So about 1 lakh people is estimated that it would have died in that situation. It is estimated about 30% of the population of Marseille almost collapsed. Now, number 11 is the Russian plague, again at the end of 18th century if you see. So it ravaged the Moscow town, Moscow city specifically, and even what happened, it was first time when violence erupted in the quarantine situation. That's why during quarantine it is very much important to maintain peace, right? Because this is one of the examples in history that it made more severe situation because people did not obey the order. So what happened? The terror of quarantine citizens left the entire Moscow ravaged, and Empress of Russia, Catherine II, you can see in the image, was so desperate to contain the plague and restore public order that she issued a hasty decree ordering that all the factories move out from Moscow. So it led to further problems. So these are some of the examples that we must remember. Okay, by the time this ended in Russia, about again more than 1 lakh people died. 12. Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic 1793, at the end. So yellow fever, very famous later on. So when yellow fever seized Philadelphia, the disease was carried by again mosquito based. Okay, so remember that, and it almost led to more than 5,000 deaths during that particular time. Flu pandemic, 13th. That is about the end of 19th century, and it is very much important because till the time flu was not such a big on scale. So this happened with the modernization, with modern industrial age, transport links. So influenza took those transport links and traveled across. So in just a few months, the disease spanned the globe, killing more than 1 million people. So the earliest cases were reported in Russia, and from there, St. Petersburg to again Europe and rest of the world spread. Now number 14 is the American polio epidemic. First in the 20th century beginning, if we say, polio impact was a very big issue. So polio epidemic that started in New York caused 27,000 cases and 6,000 deaths immediately, and polio killed thousands until development of Salk vaccine in 1954. So just imagine, it took such a long time to cure, right? So in 1954 the vaccine was developed, and gradually it ended from United States in 1979. So such a huge time period, if you see, almost 65 years, right? Now, number 15, the Great Spanish Flu. Again, if you look at the timeline, it is the World War I time, and it is very much important to understand what was the world going through at that time and why such a big devastation. So 500 million people from South Seas to North Pole fell apart in Spanish flu. Just imagine. Almost 1/5 of those died, and some indigenous communities were almost led to extinction as well. So flu spread, and major reason was poor nutrition. This is because of the impact of World War. So that was another cause, that immunity of people were very weak. That's why it had a big impact. Now, number 16, the avian influenza, the Asian flu, 1957-58. It was another big outbreak in this mid of 20th century. The Asian flu pandemic was another global impact of influenza, if you see, and again, roots in China. So that's where the first thing that you listen the word China, right from the ancient China in 3000 BC, in 20th century the second occurrences. So look at this, the roots in China, and 1 million lives almost claimed, and virus was basically avian flu virus, that is in birds, right? And total death toll was more than 1.1 million worldwide. It is about such a huge death, and in US itself it killed more than 1 lakh of people. Now, number 17, AIDS. So AIDS as a pandemic and epidemic right from 1980 is still present. Such a huge impact, right? It doesn't have a cure still, but people are making cures. So AIDS have claimed almost 35 million lives since then. Now, as we know, it first was in 1920s when in West Africa it was detected, and it made to the 20th century the entire virus strand. Now, 64% of estimated 40 million living people have in Sahara or sub-Saharan area. So African continent is the largest area which is impacted by this AIDS, right? Now, H1N1 swine flu pandemic 2009-2010, very recent, as we know, every one of us who has this idea that H1N1, when it came around 2009, it was spreading like anything in entire world, especially in US and Mexico. So that came from Mexico part. Now 1 year it took life of about 1.5 billion people across the globe. Such a huge impact of H1N1. Now let's look at West African Ebola. In 2014-16, Ebola, almost 29,000 reported cases, 11,000 deaths, and first case was reported in Guinea, and then further in Sierra Leone, Liberia, so all the parts of Northern Africa. And still Ebola doesn't have a cure vaccine. So still research is going on to that. The first known case of Ebola occurred in Sudan in 1976. And again, what is to be marked here, that it originated from bats. So bats are the source of Ebola, which again we say that our COVID-19 is also having the same source, but still it's a speculation. Then number 20, Zika virus. So Zika virus still is under research 2015 till present date, and largely in the South America and Central America, moist and humid areas, it is found and spreads through Aedes mosquitoes. So largely mosquito repellent, and also it has been found somewhere that it is also sexually transmitted in human beings. So these are the things that are part of the research. And then we have the present situation, that is our COVID-19, in which we are currently going through. So it began in December in the region of Wuhan, China, as we know, and it was new strand of that virus. So it's called novel coronavirus, and in short it is called COVID-19, right? So this is new virus that spreads as quickly as any other virus in the entire history, if you see, right? So the WHO, World Health Organization, has declared it pandemic by the end of the March, all right? Until then, already 30,000 deaths and still continuing. So the outcome of COVID-19 is still not predictable, as we are running in April right now. We don't know what is going to happen. It's unpredictable, but we can learn from pandemics in history, as we have seen throughout the top 20 that we have learned today. So let's see that and then make them the teachers. Let's look at the Spanish flu, the AIDS and others, all of them, right from the historical situation, and act accordingly. Remember the Russian one where people in quarantine did not behave, so what happened? So there are many things that we can learn from the entire historical situation and the history of pandemics. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned, stay safe. Thank you so much.